listening to the Speaking Out on Sex Abuse podcast with host Clara and Jimmy Hinton. If you're new to the podcast, please subscribe and share so you never miss an episode. Search for us on your favorite podcast app, or you can find the podcast on jimmyhinton.org and findingahealingplace.com. Please rate our show, subscribe, and share so that you can spread the word. If you would like to support us and get exclusive rewards, go to patreon.com/speakingout. Find a tier that best fits you and join as a patron of the podcast. Let's get into the show. Welcome to this week's podcast with host Jimmy Hinton.
And Jimmy's mom, Clara.
And a very special guest. We're going to do the big reveal here. Da-da-da! Boz Tchividjian. Hey, Boz.
That was very frightening. Very frightening, at least for me.
Well, we are honored to have our good friend Boz Tchividjian here for our 100th episode. And we thought it was appropriate, Boz, to bring you on. And you and I have been friends for several years now, and we've worked together and have fought back abuse together. And I'm just super proud of what you do, and super proud of what G.R.A.C.E does. And man, we're just excited to talk to you today.
Well, I'm super glad to be here. I mean, what an honor and a privilege to be with both of you. I was sharing with you all beforehand that I think this is the first time I've actually been able to speak with your mom. I think she was on a call before a few years ago, but I think as you recalled, you muted her, and so she couldn't speak. So
Thank
Clara,
you,
I think
Boz,
you
for letting that be known. Thank you.
Oh, absolutely. I think you and I should just probably have this conversation, and we can
Thank
mute
you.
Jimmy for a little.
I like that idea.
You know what? I probably have earned that. So
You have, Jimmy.
and the show would probably
I'm not
excel.
gonna, yeah, that's only a mom could say that. It's good.
That's
No,
correct.
I'm really happy to be here. And you, Jimmy, I remember a number of years ago, I read an article about you, and I just remember trying to look up your email address and reach out to you. Just amazed that in all the work that I had done to find somebody who did what you and both of you did, that was just beyond even description as far as difficult on so many levels, but did the right thing. That was such an inspiration to me in the work that I've been doing. And so I'm like, I got to reach out to this guy. And I'm glad I did, because you're a dear friend, great colleague, and love being in the trenches with you.
Yeah, likewise. I appreciate that.
Yeah.
So we kind of primed you for this episode, because on episode 99, we were really lamenting and venting and everything else about how we're not hearing advocates, or really many other people, talk about how the abuse statistics are really skyrocketing right now. Reports are going down, but the reports that are coming in are not just minor instances of abuse. In a lot of cases, it's severe domestic violence against both spouses and children. Many of these children are dying because of their wounds. These are very severe wounds, and we said that we really need to prepare as the advocacy community for when things start opening back up, to catch these kids. Right now, Florida, the good state of Florida, where you're from, where you're moving back to.
Yeah.
Caseworkers there are begging the governor to open up schools just for 2 weeks so that they can assess the injuries that the kids have sustained while they're in this quarantine. Mm-hmm. And, it breaks my heart that we're at that point where we're asking to not open up schools for education, but so that trained people can assess the damage that's being done to these kids. That's huge. So we just want to ask a couple questions to you, because I think it's interesting to get your perspective as an attorney and as an advocate. What right now is the current climate within our judicial system? Are courts deferring cases of abuse? Are they finding avenues to to seek justice. Um, and, and I guess this is kind of maybe the same question, but what about these prisons that are releasing inmates in droves? Pennsylvania is one of those states.
Absolutely.
And we are
They just
releasing
released just locally
just in our
here.
town, right? Our
Yes,
county
right in
jail,
our
we released,
town.
what was it? It was 30 or 40
Yes,
some
and
inmates in a jail that holds 130.
right. So about a third were released, and it's like we have these issues now to deal with. What do we do?
Yeah,
You know,
what's the
I
current
mean,
climate?
what's
Yeah.
going on?
I think one way to describe the current climate in the judicial system, which is very much the current climate in so many other areas, is overwhelmed. I think in many states, it didn't obviously happen at the same time, but many states began shutting down the court systems except for essential services. Essential services. So, for example, if you had a, in fact, I know in Florida has suspended all jury trials. So if you are waiting for a jury trial, whether it's a civil or criminal case, your case is not even set for trial. And what that does, you may go, well, what does that have to do with this issue? It just creates this backlog. So do you imagine when we do when the pandemic is behind us, and that day will happen, and when we do begin to things begin to open back up, it's not just a matter of opening back up. You're opening back up to utter chaos.
Yeah.
Um, and
Yes.
and so the one area of the court system, I think in just about all 50 states that has maintained operations has been emergency hearings, temporary placement shelter hearings for kids and other vulnerable people, certain criminal, first appearances for defendants, certain things that are guaranteed by the Constitution. But so you say, well, okay, well, so the essential hearings, like, temporary placement for kids and all of that. So then why is this a bad thing for kids? I mean, how is the system being overwhelmed when those things are still in operation? Well, we have to remember that these types of situations, these types of scenarios where you get notice of a child in need, government goes in, does an assessment, and maybe removes that child from the home. It involves an army of different people across the spectrum. It's not just the judge and the lawyer. It's an army of social workers and investigators and potentially medical professionals and DCF investigators and all of these things, these pieces of this puzzle that are required to effectually monitor and protect kids. And all of those are overwhelmed too. So even though the system may be operating, you've got a law enforcement is operating in many communities at just a portion of their force. They're having to prioritize what's really important. We've got limited resources, we've got even limited officers on the street. So where are we going to prioritize? Well, sadly, kids, like so oftentimes, are the ones that the priority falls way down the list. And so as a result, I think, one way to look at it is from a law enforcement standpoint would be, listen, we want peace in the streets. So if the streets are peaceful, that's our primary objective. And so if the streets are peaceful, that's a good thing. What they're not taking consideration is what's going on behind closed doors in homes, where in a normal, quote unquote, normal world, we would be addressing those types of things, at least the situations that are made known to us. And Jimmy, you said it right earlier, is so oftentimes the way kids are saved and protected is because they have encountered somebody outside their home that notices or observes concerns to the point where a report is made, and the system then puts it into full gear to address that concern, and many times fails even then, but at least it's being addressed. Well, now, like you said, kids aren't even leaving their homes. So there's not a teacher to run into. There's not a pediatrician to run into. There's not even somebody, at the grocery store or, at a just a public place that would observe something so serious that they would pick up the phone and call. And even if they did, what's the response rate in light of everything else that's going on? So yeah, you've sadly outlined a a pretty devastating situation. And we can say all this about the systems and what's working, what's not working, but what is probably, well, not probably, what is the most and the greatest tragedy of all of this is try to put yourself in the shoes of a little 7-year-old child at home who's getting beat or sexually victimized, or whose mom is getting beat or sexually victimized on a regular basis. And that 7-year-old is, think about the fact that that 7-year-old is still trying to process what this COVID thing is and why life has completely changed and why I'm stuck at home.
Yeah.
And now we've got this added layer of trauma that this child is experiencing or continuing to experience, and now they can't even reach out for help. What hope does that child have? And that's the part that should stir all of us to do exactly what you said at the beginning: is how do we deal with it now?
Hmm.
Because I don't think we just, all of us as advocates and lawyers, push pause and go, well, I don't know, we'll just wait till everything opens back up. We're
Right.
limited now, but what do we do now? But then the issue is, how can we prepare today for what's gonna come out in weeks and months to come when this pandemic is behind us?
Yeah, one of the things that we talked about in our previous episode was contacting our local police, because that's something we can do right now, and ask them, how do we help you to patrol the streets and to look for signs of distress? To just walk
Mhm.
by houses and listen, and observe what's going on in the community, and listen for those cries for help. And I know that sounds fairy tale and like it doesn't happen, but I've been living in this house for 10 years, almost 11 years, and I can count on two hands the number of times that I've literally heard people either screaming for help. One of them was down through the yard, it was through the woods, it was a real faint,
Mhm.
somebody screaming for help. And I called my wife outside because it was so surreal, and I said, "Are you hearing this?" And at first
Mhm.
she didn't hear it, but then she heard, and she said, "That's a woman who's screaming for help in broad daylight." And so
Wow.
I went down. I was the first. She had rolled a motorcycle on top of herself, and was screaming in a neighborhood that's packed with houses, and not one person came out to help the woman.
Mhm.
This stuff happens. You can observe, and we can help our local law enforcement. We can be doing that right now. I think there are ways that we can help, and you're exactly right. This isn't something that we say, well, when things open back up, we'll
Mhm.
be ready to roar. This
Mhm.
stuff is going on right now.
Yeah, and it's tough because it's these tensions that I'm observing are, on one hand you've got people screaming and hollering because somebody is calling on somebody, calling in because somebody's not wearing a mask to go out,
Yeah,
or so people getting regardless of what people think about that, people getting upset about that, saying,
yeah,
mind your own business, keep to yourself. We talk about social distancing, which I think is a bad word. I prefer physical distancing, because social distancing means, like, you mind your business, I'll mind my business. Let's all just be separated. And
yeah,
that's not what we're being told to do, but that's the narrative many have bought into. And so that when anybody observes something even if we are observing, um, that and even the few that take action, oftentimes there's great pushback on those folks because, mind your own business, social distancing, and we have to be able to say, you know what, to hell with that.
yeah,
My role, one of my roles as an adult, is to protect vulnerable people, and kids are first on that list. And you know what? They're the most vulnerable human being on the face of the earth, especially now, because they don't even have a voice. At
yeah,
least in so many circumstances, not all, but at least like in the circumstance you brought up, the woman had a voice to at least scream out for, if anybody was listening, to do
hmm,
something. So oftentimes children don't even have that. And so we have to be vigilant. We have to be proactive. Now, obviously, doesn't mean we're knocking on doors of people's houses and wanting to see their kids and all of that. There's obviously order
right,
to it. But yeah, is law enforcement? I guess my concern, Jimmy, would be, like, is law enforcement, is that even on their radar screen? I know that they're concerned about what's going on in homes, but are they doing anything to be proactive about it, or are they just waiting to get the call and then they'll respond to it? And I think we're living in an era where local law enforcement is going to have to be a little bit more proactive. And again, that's not bashing indoors, and people love to go to extremes when you have these conversations, but just to be saying, we know kids are getting hurt in our community, and many of them are getting hurt behind closed doors of their homes. So what can we do to be proactive in identifying those kids? And it's hard because we're living in a time where you can't say, hey, we're going to have a community-wide event where everybody comes out and does something together. And then that's one of the ways or reasons we do that is so we can observe, observe the kids and observe dynamics. But, I think social media and like Zoom and these various other platforms are great platforms to, for not only law enforcement, but just other people to notice what's going on inside of homes. I was talking on a panel just a week or so ago where we were talking about pastors and how can they have their antennas up for what's going on inside the homes of the church members, especially as it relates to abuse and misconduct. And one of the things we talked about was there's all of us have had a Zoom call in the last month. If you haven't, God bless you. But you
For
had a Zoom
sure.
call, and you can tell a lot, even if you're not trying. You can tell a little bit about the atmosphere and the environment in which that person is talking. And
Right.
I've been in Zoom calls where it's complete chaos and bedlam, and you can tell the tension in that home is on from a 1 to 10 is on a 9.
Yeah.
And there are others that's different. Now, of course, you can manufacture it all, but are we even thinking that way as we're having
Mm.
conversations? Any of us, anybody listening to this program, when you're having a Zoom call with somebody, are you even paying attention to what's going on in the background? What's the tension, level of tension inside that home? And for pastors, we said, listen, even if there's not necessarily abuse going on, you could be aware through these conversations. You can learn a lot about that tension level in the home, and where there may need be for you to step in and provide some type of help or service to this family.
Yeah. Yeah. That's very powerful. Um, Another question we have, how does an already overburdened system prepare for the wave of abuse reports that are coming? You talked about it. I'm reading about it. I have lots of friends who they're on the front lines. They're
Yeah.
social workers. They're welfare workers that go into the homes. Um, we just read an article in the last podcast. 20 miles up the road from us, the Women's Help Center for Cambria and Somerset counties is closed. We can open up Lowe's, but the Women's Help
Right.
Center, they shut it down. Um, and people are crying
Mm.
out, and the system is absolutely struggling right now. So, what are some things that the overburdened system can be doing to prepare for all this stuff?
I think on a larger scale, we have to come to a point as a culture, as a people, to say the abuse of children, the abuse of anybody is reprehensible, even and especially when done in a setting like this, in a pandemic, when a child is in a vulnerable person is actually in some sense imprisoned. And so when the things do open back up, we have a choice. We can minimize a lot of that abuse and go, you know what, that was a terrible time for everybody. And, I know the stress levels were high. And so we're going to cherry pick the top 1% of the most egregious of the cases. But the rest, we just can't get to all of them. And we just can't do it as much as we'd want to. I mean, that's a mentality that a lot of social workers, a lot of prosecutors, a lot of people inside the system, even some law enforcement officers have. And because they reflect the feelings that a lot of people in society have. I think of
Yeah.
and I think of an example. I had my mother-in-law just passed away about 3 weeks ago in a nursing home in Florida. Um, and my wife couldn't even, the last time we were there, which was about 2.5 weeks earlier, 3 weeks earlier, she couldn't even visit with her in person. She had to visit with her through a glass. And she and I have had many talks about that how the elderly population from so many people that at least I've been hearing is just they're already marginalized. I mean, every time we would go visit my in-laws in a nursing home, there were not many other people visiting. These people
Yeah.
are largely forgotten, and so now with this COVID and the concerns that we have for elderly people, and you're hearing more and more, they're not saying it explicitly, but it's like, you know what? They don't have a voice. They're just less important. Well, and which is reprehensible, because I think as vulnerable people, as Christians, they're more important. But that's the same. I'm afraid that's the same perspective that too many people are having with kids, as it relates to abuse, as saying, you know what, that's just the cost of a pandemic and it's terrible, but we can't prosecute everything. We've got overwhelmed, so we're gonna have to pick and choose and move on. And I hope that there are going to be at least some communities and some jurisdictions, law enforcement, prosecutors' offices, and whatnot, that don't go down that road, that actually say, like, this child will look back for the rest of their life at the most harrowing moments of their life being that month stuck in home with an abusive father or abusive mother, and we're going to do something about it. And we're going to actually, by doing something about it, we're going to communicate to that child that you are no less important than anybody else in the society. In fact, we think you're more important, which means that we're going to have to stretch, just because the system opens up doesn't mean things get actually going to be more difficult, because we're going to actively go after these cases. And there are going to be a lot of people that don't want to do that. And you're going to be swimming upstream, even with judges. There are going to be judges that are going, why are you bringing all this to me? Why is my caseload now triple or quadruple? And I've just been in the system. I know how that works. And I think we as advocates and lawyers and others have to fight up against that and swim upstream to say, I think as Jesus would. And that is, Jesus, the beautiful part of the parable of the Good Samaritan is the person who was the least expected to help actually was the one that noticed and actually did something when it certainly wasn't convenient at all. And quite frankly, it was dangerous. And I think we're going to have to be those people for these victims. And so, to answer your question, that's the big part. The specific part is, how do we begin getting equipped to do that? Whether it's in our churches, I think in our churches we can begin thinking about that now and saying, okay, when this opens back up, how are we going to identify kids who've been hurt? Like, how do we train and equip our youth workers and our childcare workers to notice and observe signs of maltreatment and abuse and what they need to do about it? And that we could go on for 20 minutes about that. And then, what can we do as advocates to push our local leaders, the elected leaders, the leaders who we vote for, to say this minimizing direction is not an option. We have to go this direction, and this direction is going to be tough, but we demand nothing less of it, because it involves the most vulnerable amongst us, and if they are not going to be zealously protected, and if we're not going to go after those who've hurt them, then none of us are protected in this society. And that's a challenge. I'm honestly, if I sit here, I'm not real hopeful for that direction. I think there are going to be pockets of places that do that, but I think by and large, I think you're going to see a lot of just sort of like, you know what, we just can't do it. They'll give the lip service of that's terrible, but you know what, we only have so much. We're stretched so thin that
Boz,
and there's some truth to that.
I think another thing that we're forgetting that's a big component of all of this is the budget to do this. The money, follow the money. I know in our state, in Pennsylvania, it's new budget time coming up, and they're already talking
you
about.
Work for the state, so
right.
You've written
I have
budgets.
been contracted with the Department of Health for 22 years, and I understand how the budget works here. And right now, the focus is COVID-19 testing, setting up testing centers, and they're going to make sure that every community, in X amount of miles has a major testing center, and mask production. We're going to have places to produce these masks. There's nothing on mental health and abuse being said. In fact, I got an email this morning saying that a lot of the funding is shrinking in other areas, mental health being one, and being put into, this testing for COVID-19 and all of that. So I'm fearing that we're going to have a bigger struggle than we think, because we're just not going to have the personnel, trained personnel. It's going to fall back on churches, really, and volunteerism. And you know how that is in today's society also. Add to that I think every family's been stretched, so to speak, by this pandemic, and are beginning to feel the pressures from it. And people just want to get back to normal. They
Yeah.
don't want an added burden added to it. They don't want to hear, I need to be watching after so-and-so or whatever. It's going to be tough. It really
Yeah.
is. Just going
Yeah,
to
Yeah.
be.
I mean, you both hit on so many points that are just powerful points. And, Mom and I in the last episode, I kind of called out advocates who are being the mask police. And I'm like, there are bigger issues right now. Not that we can't call attention to being safe and being smart. And, obviously you don't want people out there spreading this disease around. I am all for that. But, when we have advocates who that's all they're talking about when this stuff is going on right now, we need to broaden our focus a little bit and look at the bigger picture and say, man, we're already overwhelmed. I mean, every single one of us who does advocacy work, it reminds me of the passage where, Jesus is sending out the 70 and he says, I'm sending you out 2 by 2 into all these towns to prepare the way. Pray for workers. The harvest is plentiful, but the workers are few. And I feel like everybody who's in advocacy feels the weight of that, and the burnout rate is sky high. So we all need to broaden our focus right now
Right.
and say we have this tsunami that's about to
It
hit us,
is.
where
Yes.
our
Yeah.
overwhelmed
Mhm.
emotions, our overwhelmed brains, our overwhelmed calendars. I think it's going to get out of control, and we need to
Well,
prepare for that.
and I think my guess would be that people will, and I'm not, again, it's a good thing. I'm I fall into the category of really, and I think a lot of people do, is I don't think we should just all go back to normal. I think that's just so foolish.
No,
But
yeah.
Yeah.
but I would say this: I think people, even advocates who focus, on issues, for example, like you mentioned, Jimmy, the masks. I think it's sometimes easier to focus on that because in their mind, at least, there's an easy answer. Just wear a mask. If I just
Yeah.
get more people to wear a mask.
Mhm.
Well, the problem with the issue we're talking about today is there's no easy answer.
Right.
There's
Right.
it's not like I can say, hey, if we just did this, those kids in these homes would be 50% safer.
Mhm.
Right.
And so it almost becomes um, so overwhelming and almost unbearable to think about. Thinking, man, what can I do? Where I'm being told I have to limit my leaving the house. I don't have access. We've got a system that's incredibly stretched. I don't even have access to people except on social media. And so what can I do? And I guess I would go back to those advocates and say, well, do what you usually do. I mean, the reality
Right.
is there's a good
Right.
portion of advocates out there
Yep.
that do most of their advocacy in formats like this.
Yes.
And so do what you normally do, and then try as an advocate to be a support for those on the front lines, the social workers who usually get a bad rap, sometimes for good reason, but
Mhm.
sometimes not, who are the ones that are having to leave their houses and having to go and knock on doors and go and assess a situation and then go, what do I do with this child if we do remove this child from this home? And I mean, there's so many complications. Do we
Mhm.
take this child and this child will have to be quarantined for 2 weeks? And we need to be whatever we can be to those frontline folks, not just law enforcement, but to the social workers who are really the first responders in any type of call that comes in relation to the safety of a child. And to let them know, if we've got friends of ours who are social workers, if we have friends of ours, I mean, asking ourselves, and I haven't done this, like, who are people that I know who are doing that type of work? Or maybe I know people who know those types of people. And as an advocate, what can we do to just help encourage them.
Mhm.
I think
Yeah.
that's just a baby step. But I think in the life of that person, in the life of that social worker who's the one actually knocking on those doors, that is huge. I don't think we can
Yeah.
under or overestimate the impact that that has. We as advocates need to be doing that, and I don't think we're doing that enough. And I'm, pointing two fingers at myself as well.
Yeah. No, I'm with you 100%. You're
Mhm.
giving me all kinds of ideas, and now
Yeah.
you're gonna give me a sleepless night.
As if
But
you didn't
Well,
have one
I'm
last
gonna
night
no,
and
but
the
it's a
night,
good
yeah,
thing,
right.
I'm
because
gonna
I
sleep
think
like a baby.
Gosh.
uh, I'm
No,
happy to
I
carry
won't.
I'm happy to carry your burdens for you, Boz. Um,
Amen. Thank you.
but I think of Moses when his arms are so tired that he can't hold them up,
Mm,
and people had to prop his arms up on either side. And I think, the reality is I wept when I read an article yesterday, the Orlando Sentinel, about opening up schools for 2 weeks just so they can assess the
yeah.
kids. I literally cried when I read that article, because
Mm,
the weight of that statement, the weight of that plea for the governor for Florida is heavy, heavy, heavy. But there are people who are actually doing these visits and doing these
yeah.
assessments, and the things that they have to see when they walk into those homes. Um, I I can't imagine it.
Well,
I can't
we
fit. I can't. I've been
no,
doing this
I
for
yeah,
what, 10 years?
yes.
Advocacy,
Mhm,
9, 10 years,
right.
and I still can't wrap my mind around having to walk into
Mhm,
those homes day after day after
right.
day and seeing those
I
things.
love what you said, Boz, about being
Yeah.
encouragers. Um, there's a saying that I learned eons ago: "I am only one, but I am one, and to that one I may be their world." If we each
Mm,
took one and just encouraged one, we may be that person's world to give them the encouragement to keep on going.
Yeah.
So we need
yeah.
to, if
It's
we each did that, I believe so much in that, that we can really push back the tsunami, that we can help those children who are being at risk for being swallowed up in that tsunami,
mm, yeah.
Yeah.
if we just would be that one.
Yeah.
So,
That's a great. I will remember that. That's really helpful. I I think too, the other thing we need to be thinking of long term is that there are going to be many young people, and it doesn't have to be just young people and adults who will have been traumatized in ways that we can't even begin to describe
mhm,
Yeah.
during this period of time, who
mhm,
will take years, if ever, to step forward and share that. And
oh
so
yeah,
I think the tsunami is going to be, in many ways, a tsunami that goes in waves and lasts many years in
Mm.
the future. And so
yeah,
what we can be doing is helping to equip our communities, and as a Christian, I would say helping equip our church communities to become. We're doing it now, but we gotta push even harder to create and become that safe space for survivors. And I think the number of silent survivors is going to multiply, is being multiplied right
mhm,
now. And there are many who are going to leave this pandemic, get back into their communities, get back into their churches, and won't say a word, either because they're still traumatized and processing that trauma, or quite frankly, you're going to hear some that say, everybody's got all this stuff going on. The last thing I want to do is lay this out there. So I'm just going to keep
yeah,
it to
Yeah.
myself.
yeah,
We can't
mhm,
be that place in the church. We have to be that
mhm,
space, even if it's the one place in their entire world that says, no, we are a safe space, and we especially want to hear from you so we can care for you, that we can love you, that we can advocate for you, and we can even work with you in bringing the one who caused this harm to justice. But I just think that that's, to me, that's something maybe a little bit more hands-on-ish that we can do in the long term, all of us, once we get out of this
yes,
pandemic, is to be
mhm,
saying, what can I do in my church and to influence my church leadership to be aware of this and to
mhm,
want to be equipped to respond to it with excellence in a way that reflects the hope of Jesus to
Yeah.
these precious people.
right, right,
Yeah. No, I completely agree.
mhm,
And Yeah, you must have read our notes that we didn't send to you beforehand because
Yeah.
you have literally covered everything that we wanted to
Yes.
talk to you
That's
about. And
wonderful.
Oh,
Yeah.
well,
Yeah.
it's
that's
it's just it's nice to be in good company where you're thinking about these issues and being very proactive about it. And that's what I've always
mhm,
appreciated about you. And man,
mm.
you're a good friend and a good brother in Christ, and I'm glad you're living your faith out.
I feel
Well, I am.
honored that we have this 100th um, celebration, and we have Boz with us
Yeah,
for that. That
absolutely.
is,
Well,
yeah, I think that was
Absolutely.
well,
a God gift for
well,
us,
that's
for
very
many
kind.
people.
I wish my family would treat me like this. My goodness, it would be so much more pleasant.
We'll talk to them.
Yeah,
Yeah,
send them our way. We'll
yeah.
interview them.
Yeah.
There you go.
No,
Yeah.
no, 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 don't interview them because they'll be like, yeah, well, yeah, but if you just take out the trash and walk the dog a little bit more. And no, listen, I'm just grateful for the two of you. You have, like I said, just keep doing what you're doing. I know you will. It's and remember, I think what you said, Claire, earlier, we can't we have to realize our strengths, but we also have to realize our limitations, and self-care
Hmm.
is
Right.
sometimes a weakness to a lot of advocates. And I think taking that time, the self-care, I told somebody the other day, they're asking me about a book about abuse that had recently come out. And I looked at him and I said, I make this a point to you. I said, but I don't read, I read very few books on abuse. I said, when I read,
Hmm.
that's my sort of self-care. And
Yeah.
and so I read on topics that are other than that. And I don't do enough self-care, but if everybody advocates need to pick those things that they can do on a regular basis to take care of themselves, not because we're indispensable, but because we have work to do. And part of that work requires us to be taking care of ourselves so we can do the work that I believe we've been called to do. So thank you both for
Thank
doing
you.
that. And take care of yourselves.
Thank you.
Absolutely. Well, thank you, Boz, and thank you to our listeners for tuning into this 100th episode. We'll catch you in the next episode.
Thanks again for listening to today's episode. Thank you to our patrons who make this podcast possible. If you found it helpful, please follow on Spreaker and search for the Speaking Out on Sex Abuse podcast in your favorite podcast app. Be sure to hit subscribe and rate the show. If you believe in what we do, consider supporting the podcast by becoming a patron and check out the cool rewards our patrons receive. Share with your friends and tell the world. Join us in speaking out on sex abuse so we can change the tides and prevent abuse.